All right, at this point, you should have pages 1 through 3 already done, and now we're ready to move on to pages 4, 5, and 6. When you're done watching this movie and you fully understand all of the beginning pages, you can attempt to do pages 7 and pages 8 on your own, and that will prepare you for our first quiz. So today what we're going to be doing is a bunch of proofs, all right? But in order to write a proof, it's very important that you plan what you're going to say in the proof. You plan what you're going to do. Plan what you're going to have a game plan before you can start the proof. All right, so that's what we're going to start working on here. We're going to look at this proof, okay, and we're going to prove what we need to prove, but we need to figure out what steps we need to do in between. All right, so let's just mark up this triangle based on what we're given. So we're given that SD, which is a side, is congruent to TC, which is a side or a segment. So this segment here, TC, is congruent to this segment here, SD. Okay, and I'll highlight it in red just in case it's not clear. Those two segments are congruent. Those two sides of two triangles are congruent. All right, we also know that CS, which is a side or a segment, is congruent to DT. So we know that this side here, this green side, and I'll put 2 ticks on it, okay, is congruent to DT here. And I'll put 2 ticks on it as well. All right, what we want to prove, okay, what we want to prove is that this triangle here, SCT, okay, is congruent to this triangle here, TDS. All right, that's what we're trying to prove. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw these two triangles to the side so we can get a better look at them. Okay, so we're going to go like this. Okay, and then like this. All right, so we have triangle CST. Do we see how that more or less looks the same? And then DTS. Okay, so I'm going to label this accordingly. So we know that CT is congruent to DS, and we know that CS is congruent to DT. All right, so what we want to do, okay, ultimately by the end of this proof, and I'm going to put this in blue, is that we want to prove that angle SCT, so angle SCT, this angle here, is congruent to angle TDS, this angle here. All right, we don't know that. That's what we want to prove. So what we're doing now is we're creating our plan. We're trying to figure out how we can get there. And how we can get there, all right, is by first proving that these two triangles are congruent. So we're going to write first, we're going to prove that triangle TCS is congruent to triangle SDT. All right, so once we prove those two triangles are congruent, right, we can easily then know that those angles that are wanted to be congruent are congruent because we know that all corresponding angles and all corresponding sides of congruent triangles are congruent. So once we do that, we're going to conclude that angle SCT is congruent to angle TDS. Okay, knowing that those two angles have to be congruent if the two triangles are congruent. All right, and the way we're going to prove those two triangles are congruent is pretty simple. All right, if we look at our original picture again, you'll notice that our two triangles share a segment. Okay, as I'm drawing the outlining these two triangles, you'll see that one of my segments I go over multiple times, and that's the segment ST, the segment ST down here. ST and ST are the exact same segment. So you know what we can say about those is we can say that those segments are congruent because they're the same exact segment. So I can put 3 ticks on it and 3 ticks on it. And now look what I have. I know that all 3 sides are congruent in my two triangles, so I know that I have side, 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 so my triangles are congruent. So now that we have this plan, this idea of how we're going to attack this problem, let's go through and actually see if we can attack it. All right. So in a proof, remember we have two columns. The first column is for statements where we make logical conclusions, and then the second column is when we defend those conclusions. Okay, so our first statements are always just what we're given. We're given that SD is congruent to TC, and we're given that CS is congruent to DT. That's just what we're given, so we just, for our reason, all we do is that we write that it's given to us. Okay, so now step number 2 is something that we can just go forth on our own. All right, so we already know that CT is congruent to DS, and we already know that CS is congruent to DT. Well, something that I see that we already talked about is that this line here is in both triangles. So obviously it's the same length because it's the same exact segment. So I'm going to write for my step number 2 that side ST is congruent to side ST. And then for my Y, I'm going to write they are the same segment. There we go. So now let's move on to our third thing. Well, our third thing is pretty obvious right here, right? We have 3 sides that are congruent to another 3 sides in a different triangle. So right here we can conclude the triangles are congruent based on side, side, side theorem. So what I'm going to say now is triangle SCT is congruent to triangle TDS. Okay, and why? Because of the SSS theorem. All right, so now we've completed our step 1 of our plan, right? We've proved that my 2 triangles are congruent. So now we just need to show that angle C up here is congruent to angle D up here, okay? So we're going to say step 4. All right, we're going to say that angle SCT, which is just angle C, don't get confused by it, is congruent to angle TDS. Okay, so that's our final thing. Now we just need to defend it. And in order to defend it, all we need to say is that corresponding angles of congruent triangles are congruent. All right, but instead of saying corresponding angles or congruent triangles are congruent, we're going to write a well-known acronym, all right, in geometry that's called CPCTC. All right, and basically what it stands for is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, and we can use this reason over and over and over, so we don't really have to go with angle or side. We can always just say CPCTC, corresponding parts of corresponding triangles are congruent. And there we go, we've proved it. Let's go on to another one. Let's create a plan. All right, so when we're looking at here, we know that GMJ, so GMJ, we know that this angle here is a right angle, okay? And we know that HMJ is also a right angle. That's given to us. And then we know that GF is congruent to HF, okay? And we know that angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent. All right, so what they want us to prove is that angle GJM right here, GJM right here, okay, they want us to prove that that angle is congruent to HJM, which is right here. All right, so this one is going to take us a little bit longer than the other one is going to take us, but we can do it. I have faith in us. All right, so let's get rid of all of our marks, and let's make a plan. Okay, so we need to show, okay, essentially that we have triangles that are congruent, okay, and then once that we have 2 triangles that are congruent, we can just say CPCTC, or corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, and then we're good. So my game plan is to conclude that this triangle here is congruent to this triangle here, and if we can do that, then we know that these angles here and here are congruent because of CPCTC. All right, so our plan is to show that triangle GFJ is congruent to triangle HFJ, okay? And then we're gonna call CPCTC, and we're gonna say that angle GJM is congruent to angle HJM. That's our plan, all right? But in order to do that, we do need to finish some other details of the plan. So right now, in these two blue triangles that I see some pieces of information, okay? I see that GF is congruent to HF, so I know that I have a side in common, okay? I know that angle 1 here is congruent to angle 2, so I know that I have an angle, all right? Now I need a third piece of information. So I have a side and I have an angle and I need a third piece. But what I notice about my two blue triangles is that they share a side. They share this side right here. So obviously FJ has to be congruent to FJ because it's the same segment, so I have my third side. So if you look at this, I actually have side, angle, side, which gives me two congruent triangles. So now that we have our plan, let's go through and try to attack it. All right, so we're gonna go through and we're gonna start with number 1 and we're gonna do our given information. All right, so we aren't really using the right angle part, so I'm not going to include the right angle part right now, so we'll just go with GF is congruent to HF, and angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and our reason for that is given. They just give it to us. As we go on to here, we can say that FJ is congruent to FJ. We can say that this segment here is congruent to itself, right? So I can put 2 ticks on it. And why can I put 2 ticks on it? Well, because it's the same segment. And every segment is congruent to itself, okay? And then I can move on and say that my two triangles are congruent. So I can say that triangle GFJ is congruent to triangle HFJ. And for my explanation, I see that I have a side that's congruent, then an angle, and then a side. So I have SAS, okay? So I know my two triangles are congruent, and knowing my two triangles are congruent, I can conclude that these angles down here are congruent to each other. So I can say that angle GJM is congruent to angle HJM. And then for my Y, I know that they're congruent. Why? Because corresponding parts of corresponding triangles are congruent, or CPCTC. All right, so at this point, I would kind of pause things and start trying to go over things yourself, all right? So on this triangle, we know that WYX, so this angle here, is congruent to this angle here, all right? And we know that this angle here is congruent to this angle here, all right? And we want to prove that WX is congruent to ZY. Our plan is essentially the same. The first thing that we want to do is prove that the triangles are congruent. So prove that WXY is congruent to triangle ZYX. Once we do that, then we can call CPCTC, all right? And that would let us conclude that WX, that side, is congruent to ZY, all right? So first, we have to figure out how we can conclude that these two triangles are congruent. Well, once again, I see that my two triangles share a side. I see that both of them share the segment XY. And if you note this segment being shared, it has to be the same length, right? So now when I look at it, I have two angles, 2 known congruent statements about angles, and 1 congruent statement about a side. And I just had to figure out if my side is in between my 2 angles. So when looking at my 2 angles, one's there and one's there, and I put my finger on both angles and then I move my fingers together, I see that I do end up on that side. So that side is in the middle of my 2 angles. So I have ASA, which will be my defense for proving that those 2 triangles are congruent. All right, so now we just go into writing the proof out. Okay, so our first statement that we would write is the given information. So we can say WYX, which is an angle, is congruent to angle ZXY, and angle WXY is congruent to angle ZYX. And then for my y, I can just say it's given to me because that's what they do. They just give me this information. All right, my next statement that I need to make is saying xy, the side, is congruent to xy, the side. And how do I know those 2 are congruent? Well, they're the exact same side. So all I say is same segment. All right, and now that I have my 3 pieces of information, I can say that triangle WXY is congruent to triangle ZYX, and then I can say my reasoning y is angle, side, angle. And now that I know that my 2 triangles are congruent, based on the fact that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, I can now say that WX is congruent to ZY. I can say that WX up here is congruent to ZY, and my reason why would be that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, or CPC-TC. All right, at this point we've gone through pages 4, 5, and 6, all right, and we have all of our proofs written. You will notice that we skipped the part where we said paragraph proof. So what I want you to do when you end and close this video is go through and write in a few sentences exactly how we proved it in your own words, okay? And that is another way of writing a proof. So you're going to go through and you're going to summarize what we did in the statements column and the reasons column and make it make sense. Make it a story of how we proved the triangles are congruent and then we concluded something from that congruence. All right, if you have any questions, please call me over. And remember that pages 7 and 8 are good practice for this topic.